Now, why is that? Tell me why.
Well, I flew combat assaults primarily, and we did a lot of our own medevac extractions. And so we would fly troops into LZs, and many times they would, what they call hot, they would be firing at you going in.
What's an LZ?
A landing zone.
Okay.
So typically
So those
we
were
flew,
hot, and they weren't secure in any way. You were actually flying this helicopter in, and they were shooting at you at the same time.
most of the time, right?
Wow. Do you have a co-pilot?
Yes, I flew what they call slicks or UH-1 Hueys, and you had two pilots, co-pilot, an aircraft commander and a pilot.
So one of your primary things was to fly in and pick up some wounded, or drop other service people in, or?
Well, typically you would fly troops into an insertion area where they would confront or do combat operations. And then after that was completed, or if there was casualties, you would pick up the casualties, and then you would pick up those troops that you inserted at the end of the operation. So it's, you put them in and then you take them back out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I would assume then, especially on the missions where where you knew you were picking up casualties, you had to have medical personnel on board when you went in, or how did that happen?
Well,
You had a
there
certain
are
crew.
medevac units that they could call in,
Yeah.
but because we were right there in the area, we just did most of all the extractions ourselves. And usually with 5 helicopters, with rotations, even if one got shot down or you had casualties, there was somebody. I usually tried to fly trail, which was your responsibility to pick up anybody that had difficulty or were shot down or had casualties.
So you kind of went out in a squadron, in a sense, of 4 or 5 helicopters usually?
Yes, usually 5 was the typical. Sometimes you just do 2 for inserts, but typically 5.
Mm-hmm. And the medevac helicopters, which you weren't officially flying one of those, just because you were there, they ended up, bringing wounded people back out.
Right.
So in other words, you could have some severely wounded people being tossed in the back of your helicopter, and you fly to the next safe location.
Right.
Or right. How long did you serve with all of this? I mean, this is intense
Well,
war.
it was 12 months. That was the normal.
And how many
tour.
missions would you say you flew?
Missions?
Now,
I don't know.
I know I'm not using the correct terminology. What would
Yeah,
you call it?
Well, I flew
Do they
about
count
1,000
so many
combat
times?
hours in
Oh,
a year.
wow.
So that's about 100, average about 100 hours a month.
Right.
And what we tried to do is alternate days. So one day you flew combat assaults, the second day you flew what they called ash and trash, which was a variety of things, from resupplying to picking up seals out in the middle of nowhere, to putting in sensors. We even didn't know what we were doing, but we even sprayed some of that Agent Orange, some of the missions.
Yeah.
So it was a variety of things. So they tried to alternate it so you didn't have a combat assault every day.
Mm-hmm. And as we sit here, Ken, and talk about this, this isn't movie-making stuff. This is the real world. This is the real war that you as a Vietnam veteran and all the veterans that we're honoring, this holiday lived through. And it's just hard for me to wrap my head around it, but I can't help but sit here and just look at you while we're talking and realize that, the words come out, but the memories and the pictures that you have to somehow carry in your mind of some of these horrific events. Did you have, troubles with that? Did you know people that did? PTSD, if we want to call it, post-traumatic stress?
Yeah, they didn't call it that, but there were certain events. There were particular times I was shot down three times. One in particular where we were ordered to come in over known enemy, and it was very difficult to do that when you knew, we wanted to go around another way, but we were ordered. So you go through that, and then you get hit with this 51 caliber, and it gets your helicopter on fire, and you go down and smoke and you survive it. And so it's a mixed feeling. You know, you're mad because you were ordered to do this and you knew you were going to get shot down, but you're survived it. And,
Right.
and so, you know, for a while you have nightmares about that kind of a thing, but then, you know, it usually fades. There were some pilots that I knew that in that particular episode, which they survived it, but they could never fly again. You know, they just couldn't put themselves back. But I think it's like most things. If you get right back in and get over that initial fear, then that's not probably your best approach.
Right, right. So there were some that actually were in the same situation as you, but they couldn't, so to speak, get right back on the horse.
Right, and then they put it off, and then basically they never flew again. So you just have to get right back in and get through it, and then I think it's probably the best approach.
Well, and especially when you're there and you're in active duty and you never know when you're going to be called to go back out on your next mission. You know, and I think we're going to have to head into a little bit of a break here, but I do want to talk a little bit about, first of all, we've done some programs here on the Joan Jerkovich Show about post-traumatic stress disorder, but talking to different veterans from different war times, it was treated very differently. You were treated very differently as a veteran coming back from the Vietnam War, right?
Yeah, it was quite dramatically different. So.
And we're going to get into that in our next segment here, and we're going to take a little break, but we want to hear some more about, you know, what Ken Bernard here has to talk about. This is Joan with the Joan Jerkovich Show, and be sure to go to the video outtakes, podcasts, and links to iTunes and my blogs on joanjerkovich.com. We'll be right back on 910 KINA Salina. I know we talked about that a little bit on your when we visited on the phone, you know, when I called you up and stuff, because things have changed so much with the recognition that our service people are coming back with some serious issues. And interesting, you know, my husband George, you know, we were talking about the very traumatic incident. One of the reasons I know that this war was not popular in part was the time when they went in to massacre the women and children. Remember?
Yeah, the Cali incident?
I'm not sure if that... Yeah. Oh, yes. Was that...
Is that the one where he massacred the...
Yes, William Cali. And 26 soldiers. That was called the My Lai. And, you know, it was interesting because that's a difficult thing to even think about, much less talk about, where they claim the civilians, you know, were massacred, and of course the protests relative to that. But in talking with my husband about this, you know, he had studied and read enough about it that, you know, they were under siege for over 6 hours, heavy siege, casualties, and then this preceded happened right after that. And he does work right now as a psychiatrist with PTSD here in Salina at the hospital. And what he sees, you know, with PTSD and service people, you just can't know what their mental state was having been through all that. And I thought from just the historic account of it, I was glad for him to weigh in on that, because I just felt that, you know, he had just a broader perspective having dealt with so many people. And we just don't, any of us know how we'd react in some of these situations too.
Well, yeah, and when I first went over, so I flew gunships, and I was teamed up with a pilot that had just lost his co-pilot, or, you know, someone that he lived with, actually. And he was kind of went berserk. I mean, he would see somebody going down a dike and roll in and fire 10 rockets, just this crazy stuff.
Overboard because he was that was
reacting
how he was dealing
to
with
his
it.
loss, right? So, and everybody's going to do that differently, and the circumstances
Absolutely.
are different. You just can't come up with policies to say this or that.
Yeah, you have to support the service people. Well, we're going to get back to the final segment. This always seems to go so fast because I'm fascinated by what you're talking about here. We could talk about so much. We're going to just do a short 8, Ben.
8?
Mm-hmm. So when we're ready, I'll take a drink and.
Whenever you're ready.
Welcome back, listeners. This is Joan with the Joan Jerkovich Show on 910 KINA. We're wrapping up our conversation with Ken Bernard, our Vietnam veteran who was a helicopter pilot. And again, go to the outtakes because we were talking on video about, some of the reasons that this war was so unpopular. One of them was the My Lai incident where the platoon leader was actually prosecuted for the murder of supposed, some defenseless women and children. But I think the important part here that I want to bring across is what Ken and I were talking about on break, is how we do not know how service people are going to react in these situations. They had been under an extended siege, lots of casualties before this occurred, and he was just telling me too, and if you go to the video you'll hear about that, about some of the people you served with. You saw their reaction to some of the horrific things they found be a little what we'd call bizarre, but are we there really to judge that? We don't know how they'll react, right? No one knows.
And you don't know how yourself will react. And you never know, too, you talk about this post-traumatic stress, which is pretty popular now, but with the current situation with the EIDs, with the
explosive devices
and the head concussions, that's a whole different realm in itself, as well as seeing people that you know and you're close to get killed and so forth. So you never know. And the other thing, I've gave talks at history classes, local high schools and so forth about Vietnam. And one time, this is about the 4th or 5th time, and I just was sharing my yearbook and some of the things, and I realized the pictures in the yearbook, we were just kids, 19, 20-year-olds, and the high school kids were the same age, and, that innocence and how quickly you can go from just a normal activity to a horrific war situation, and, it just choked me up. So you never know how that's going to affect you.
You could see something
later
of that your young self in
Right,
those
it
high
just
school
brought back
students,
that
because you could look
innocence.
at them and say, in 6 months from now, you could be
That's right.
experiencing what I did. Absolutely. And let's talk just a little bit about the unpopularity of this war and its effects on veterans, on the Vietnam veterans.
Well, when you're in any, combat situation, it's real important to know that what you're doing, you're putting your life on the line there for your country, and so it's important to know that that's not done in vain, and that you do have that support. In Vietnam, it was pretty much the opposite. You were considered the warmonger, and even though you were in this draft and you didn't have much choice. So when I got back, my wife's parents put up a big sign, "Welcome home, Ken," and I couldn't wait to get that down because I didn't
Really?
want the neighbors to know I was a Vietnam
That's
veteran.
tragic in itself.
Well, it is. But
And
that's
so
a
did the
different-
service people that were in active service know what was going on in society in the United States,
yes,
at Kent
sure.
State University with the murders there and the protests at the colleges? They knew about that?
Yes.
You got enough news that came
Right,
across that. And how did that affect the morale while you were actually serving? Much less
Well,
coming home feeling like I'm ashamed, or I don't even want to be seen as a returning veteran.
Well, like anything, you can take a positive or a negative, and you concentrated on doing your job, and